All right, good morning.
Wow.
Wow, we're light on the ground today. Must be all the science that we're talking about.
Some of her pictures she took.
Yeah. So we'll see. Listen, I wanted to mention before we begin, so I had forgotten to bring these last week, When Science Meets Religion. This is a classic by Ian Barber. And then this book, Science and Religion, A Historical Introduction. These are two of the books I have on my shelf at home that is basically looking at the interplay between science and religion, obviously. We talked a little bit about that last week, and so I thought I would just mention those as sources. Now, I mean, you know, this one is a bunch of different chapters written by different people, but are dealing with all of the kind of associated things. There'll be a chapter on Galileo, for example, evolution, physics, you know, that sort of thing. Creationism since Darwin's time, and so forth and so on. Again, there is a temptation for Christians to adopt the latest scientific theory or ideas into the reading of the Bible. A lot of times, though, those scientific ideas change dramatically, and now you're stuck with an interpretation of the Bible that was fitting a now kind of obsolete scientific approach to, you know, the world and that sort of thing. And then I wrote a book, Snubbing God. I love the cover. I didn't come up with a cover. The publisher did. But oddly enough, they sent me it, but they had the hands reversed. So they actually had God, because you remember this is the Sistine Chapel. They had God snubbing Adam. And I was looking at it, I thought, I was so enamored by the cover, I thought it was just a great idea. And then, fortunately, I was the one that said, hey, you got the hands, you got God doing it to Adam. But anyway, so this is the high cost of rejecting God's created order. And the premise of the book is, in essence, Genesis lays out an order for how God expects things to run. Every time that we overstep that, or we change it, or ignore it, or whatever, we bring peril to ourselves. But this book opens with 4 chapters on science and evolutionary theory. And then it goes into the ethics of it. If you're not an advanced ape-like creature, but you're made in the image of God, then how should you behave? Because you can behave very differently depending on those two worldviews. And it goes through sanctity of life, marriage, even the environment, gender roles, sexuality, and so forth and so on. And I have a few copies left. If anybody's interested, you can talk to me about that. All right. What we're going to do today is continue with evolutionary theory. Now, before I open with prayer, I just want to say something that my wife said. So there, she's grinning already. So every day we drive home from church, and I say, so, honey, and I always say, honey, to try to soften the blow, but it never works. I say, how did you think Sunday school went? And then she gives me a blunt assessment.
And then she says, I thought the sermon today was really good.
Yeah. When Jeff preaches, that is true. Oh, yeah. Don't.
I got something I gotta do.
Yeah. Don't pick on the teacher. That is the lesson here, right? So anyway, I just wanted. So she said, we didn't even look at the Bible today. It was all science. And I said, yeah. And I said at the beginning that's what it was going to be. But I understand that. I agree with that assessment. So here's the thing. This is the reigning scientific worldview for how existence has gotten here. When you're talking to atheists, agnostics, skeptics, whoever, and even some Christians have taken it and incorporated this. They've just thrown God into the equation. But generally speaking, this is the belief. And my conviction is if we don't understand this well, we're not going to be able to properly engage people. You're just going to look like an idiot. Just as much as people who criticize our Christianity and do it from false premises. and from caricatures and whatever. We know right away, why should I listen to you? You don't even know what you're talking about. Well, we don't want to do that as well. So I apologize if we're not opening the Bible. We could go to Genesis 1, which we've already done before, and look at what it means to be made in the image of God and that sort of thing. But I'm just going to assume that you know that, and you know that view is kind of in competition with this one. Genesis chapter 1 does not read like God took a pre-existing ape-like creature and made Adam from it. Okay? That it just does not read that way. And so, knowing that we're going to spend time on the science, we need to be able to test the scientific theories from a science perspective. And we're going to continue to do that today and next week. And then we're done with this topic of evolutionary theory. All right, I'm just going to open with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the opportunity that we have to come together today. And we just ask that you would give us insight through your Spirit into what is, in many respects, a competing worldview. And we just ask that you would help us to understand these things rightly. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Just a couple of quotations, again, just for fun. Evolution as a process that has always gone on in the history of the earth can be doubted only by those who are ignorant of the evidence or are resistant to evidence owing to emotional blocks or to plain bigotry. Okay, again, this is just to give you some idea of people with a point of view on evolution. For scientists, evolution is a fact. We know that life evolved with the same certainty that we know the earth is roughly spherical, that gravity keeps us on it, and that wasps at a picnic are annoying. Okay? Very interesting. I like the way they've put it. It's fun. Catchy. But this is it. Evolution is a fact. Well, what do they mean by evolution here? Last one. It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. That one is Richard Dawkins, just for fun. He never pulls any punches. I like it. So you can see, this is, when you're out there speaking to people, if you were to say, I don't believe in evolution, like we talked about last week, you understand that for many people, this is the conclusion they will immediately make about you. Now, like I said last week, it's probably better to say something like, I don't believe humans evolved from an ape-like creature or something like that, as opposed to, I don't believe in evolution, because the word evolution is used in a variety of ways, and so there you go. Or maybe this one, I don't believe all life on the planet descended from the same one-celled organism, because that is Darwinian evolutionary theory. You get a one-celled organism, and from that, all life, not just animal, but plant as well, branches off of that. It's one tree with one trunk and everything else coming off of it. Okay? And so you might want to say something more specific like that. I don't believe in evolution. Well, like we talked last week, variations within kinds, like dog breeds, are a kind of evolution. We're seeing a kind of evolution here in the room. We're not all clones, okay, and so forth and so on. So I just want you to be wary of that. Here's variation within kinds. What I mean by kinds is a canine kind or a feline kind, these sorts of things. God has created the DNA of creatures so that they're able to adapt given different environmental conditions. There is no doubt about that. This is the genius of our design. Now, humans obviously have a capacity to also then build structures and work around environmental conditions or move, and things. Animals can do all of those to some degree. But the fact is, within the makeup of creatures, God has created a DNA that is able to modify and adapt and vary for different environmental conditions within a kind. And this is going to be the difference. So there's variation within kinds. That's small changes within limits versus big picture evolution, which is unlimited change. You can get a bear-like or a deer-like creature that eventually wanders into the water and over a lot of time becomes a whale. 100-foot-long blue whale from a deer. Okay? That's big picture evolution. And we're going to see that. We're going to see that in really good detail today. Okay? So let me just ask this question. Should we believe that farmers, through directed breeding, could transform a worm into a human being? If I had farmers and said, here's a group of worms, I want you, through your intelligence and your intellect and all of that, to breed these worms in such a way that eventually we'll get human beings out of them. Now you might say, oh, they're not going to have the amount of time that is needed for that. Well, I just want to know, do you think that that would be possible? Breeding, right? Like with dogs. Do you think that we could breed dogs in such a way that eventually we might be able to get, I don't know, a bear or something? That's the question. If you said no, then why should we believe that a blind, unintelligent evolutionary process can do it? Just throw enough time at it. That is evolutionary theory. From a worm, eventually, by accidental, random genetic processes, that worm changed into something a little more complex and a little more complex and so forth and so on, all the way up to you and me today. Now, here's where I'm going to say is the big error of evolutionists. They see adaptation and variation, and they falsely conclude that these can result in new kinds, completely new species. Well, species is a tricky word. Kinds I'm just going to have to stick with. So again, I showed you a picture last week of dog breeds. And you know, so many of them are brand new as well. Doodles in everything now, right? Okay. I'm waiting for the snickerdoodle, because those are both a very obedient dog and very tasty too. Okay. But all of that is to say that, yeah, we keep making new breeds of dogs. Nobody in this room is going to have a problem with that. And that is a form of evolution. In terms of the variations within the canine kind, we believe that all domesticated dogs came from wolves, all of them, at some point. There must have been some kind of canine kind from which foxes and jackals and wolves and everything else branched off. But did we get a feline off of a canine kind or whatever? You know, these are the questions. And what I see with example after example after example, the peppered moths in England, Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands, is that we rightly observe that within a certain kind, a certain creature, we have adaptation. And Darwin saw that with his finches, that they were the same finches, but the beaks were slightly different, depending on where they were trying to get their food, on which island of the archipelago for the Galapagos he was on. And Darwin was a genius with this. He was an absolute genius with observational science. And he was tedious. I mean, and that's what you needed to be. He was the perfect guy for doing what he did in the biological realm, in the botanical realm, and all of that. But just because these changes of adaptation and variation occur within kinds, you cannot make the leap to say, oh, just throw enough time at it and you can get a worm that eventually becomes a human. And that is going to be my main gripe. And example after example after example is exactly this problem. And I read it all the time. Listen, I've been fascinated by evolutionary theory since I was a teenager. So you look at the books on my shelves, and more of them are about science and things than they are about theology, quite honestly. All of that is to say, this is where I think the main mistake is. So let me just ask, any questions about that before I move on? Okay, good. We're back to the evolutionary formula again. I just want you to see it. We'll talk more in detail about it next week as well. But in essence, you have starting material. You then get random genetic mutations. That is the mechanism by which new information is introduced. Natural selection is a process by which now nature chooses through these new variations which one is the best for survival. Now, nature doesn't do that intelligently, but environment changes, all of a sudden things get really cold, and the animals that don't have really thick fur by accident are the ones that are going to die off, and the thick-furred ones are going to continue, and they're going to pass on their genes to their, progeny who are going to now have thick fur, and so forth and so on. And then you need a lot of time. You need oodles and oodles and oodles of time to ultimately get from a worm. A worm was about 3 billion to 4 billion years ago to humans today. Okay, and that is going to account for everything. That formula is really going to be important. So now, last week, we talked just briefly about cosmological evolution. That is, how did we get stars? Where did things come from? And we know that there's something called the Big Bang. And a lot of Christians have looked at the Big Bang and they've said, see, God just did it this way. And I have no problem with that. He made things. He made everything. Nothing existed, and then God brought it into existence. That is what our Christian theology teaches us. Remember, before the Big Bang, which was only adopted as the reigning scientific cosmological paradigm in my lifetime, now I was a baby then, but that's it, okay? Before that, it was believed the universe was eternal. Christians were telling scientists day after day, for decades, you're wrong. We know that God made it. It had a beginning, and Christians were called idiots for that. Then the science changed, and a lot of Christians said, see, we told you so, and we just adopted the Big Bang idea without a lot of thinking sometimes, at least initially. Because all of a sudden it was like we're off the hook. Now science recognizes that the universe had a beginning, which is what we've been saying all along. But the Big Bang itself still needs to be questioned scientifically. And that's what I'm doing. I want to know, does it make scientific sense what is being taught to us as if it is fact, as if it is gospel in our science textbooks? Throwing God into the equation does not make for good science. Just understand that, okay? You can't just say, well, for every mystery that we don't have, well, we just throw God in there. That's not how you do science. You just can't do science that way. And you wouldn't want your doctor doing that if you were sick and he said, I can't figure out what your problem is. I guess God must have done it. No, figure it out for me, please. Something's wrong with my body. Where's it going wrong, okay? That sort of thing. Bruce sent me an article this week, and it was from PLOS One, PLOS1. It's Public Library of Science. It is a peer-reviewed open journal. Anybody can submit an article to it, but then it gets reviewed by their editors and all that, and it's a free open journal of science. Okay, so that's really quite nice. And there was an article that had been submitted by 3 Chinese scientists who were in China. One here was at MIT, and they were just looking at the human hand. And the article itself goes into great detail about all the things that are involved with just the human hand and its ability to work and grasp and the opposable thumb and everything else. And they made the mistake of talking about a creator. They used the word twice. And sorry, all hell broke loose in the scientific community, okay? Complaints coming about how can you do that? Ultimately, people are saying, you know what? They wrote in Chinese originally, It was translated into English, and they were just talking about the creation of the hand through evolutionary processes. But it got so many complaints, the article had to get pulled. The editor in charge of that article lost his position. Okay. Canceled. Okay. Simply because these guys said the hand was created. They came back and they said, no, we didn't mean some, spirit being did this. We meant it was created through evolutionary processes, blah, blah, blah. It didn't matter. All of this is to say that if you want to bring God in, you're going to have trouble. And that brings us to the whole intelligent design movement, which is a lot of scientists today are just looking at creation and saying it's got the fingerprints of design all over it. That this happened by accident over millions and millions of years, and I would assume thousands and thousands of accidental mutations, doesn't strike me as viable. It must have been designed. Now, some people say it was designed by aliens who were intelligent life forms that came to Earth, and that's how we got the pyramids. And all those sorts of things, okay? And you just kick the can down the road. That's all you've done, because where did those aliens come from, and so forth and so on. The intelligent design movement is basically saying, these are top-notch, world-class scientists, philosophers, thinkers that are saying there's just no way that these things came by accident. And they like to talk about irreducible complexity. That is, even when you reduce a certain organism down to its constituent parts, there's certain things that you can't reduce it down any further before it ceases to function in a way. And so here it is. It's the genetics, DNA and RNA. You might have heard, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Right? You've heard that. I remember that as a kid and always wondering, wasn't that kind of stupid? God made a chicken and then it laid an egg. I never quite got what the problem was because, I was assuming God made the first chicken. Okay? Well, no, if he didn't make the first chicken, but these processes were the result, you can break it all the way down to the genetics of it. So, DNA stores the plans to build the organism. It's the blueprint for how to build the organism. RNA reads the plans in the DNA and transports those plans in protein assembly lines. I don't know if you've ever seen these. Go look online to how they depict them. It's just absolutely amazing. I mean, within your DNA, there's a postal system that takes the information from here, transports it over here to the factory so that things can be built to the code, to the specific genetic information. It's just fascinating, okay? Here's the problem. While RNA is required to read DNA, the coding for making RNA is in the DNA. Are you following me? You have to have both of them there for it to happen. This is a quote from Richard Dawkins. The catch-22 of the origin of life is this: DNA can replicate, but it needs enzymes in order to catalyze the process. Proteins can catalyze DNA formation, but they need DNA to specify the correct sequence of amino acids. He's saying it in a more complex way. But the fact is, you have the plans for how to build RNA in the DNA, but you need RNA to read the plans to build anything. Where do you get it? It's a vicious circle. It's an irreducibly complex system. You need both of these at the same time. But in the absence of God, they have to appear accidentally at the same time and in the same ratios and at the same place and all of those things. And the odds are just astronomical for something like that happening. Or you say, you know what? I think this was created by somebody. It's just too complex. Okay, here's another one of irreducible complexity. The human eye. It's got about 17 different parts. And the argument basically says, without all 17 together in synchronicity, if you would, the eye just simply doesn't work. All of these parts had to arise at the same time or accidentally, and evolutionists are going to say no. No, it did by parts and pieces. So let me just tell you, this is an evolutionist commentary on this. When evolution skeptics want to attack Darwin's theory, they often point to the human eye. How can something so complex, they argue, have developed through random mutations and natural selection even over millions of years? Just look at that eye again and everything that has to take place. And we haven't even gotten to the brain yet, which has to now, analyze that information and change it into something visual so that you can act on it and all that. All of these parts here, if you do not have a designer, then it has to be by random mutation and natural selection. Okay, so continue. And they're still asking the skeptic question, if evolution occurs through gradations, the critics say, how could it have created the separate parts of the eye, the lens, the retina, the pupil, and so forth, since none of these structures by themselves would make vision possible? In other words, what good is 5% of an eye? Okay, this is very fair. These guys, and this is from an evolutionary website that Public Broadcasting, PBS, was quoting from, okay? This is where I got it. This is a very fair portrayal of an evolutionary skeptic and what they would say. Here's the answer. Darwin acknowledged from the start that the eye would be a difficult case for his new theory to explain. Difficult, but not impossible. Scientists have come up with scenarios through which the first eye-like structure, a light-sensitive pigmented spot on the skin, could have gone through changes and complexities to form the human eye with its many parts and astounding abilities. Do you notice what they are already saying? Just in that paragraph. What is kind of the thing they've slipped past the goalie there?
It could have.
Well, no. You first start with a light-sensitive pigmented spot on the skin. And my first question is, well, where did that come from? Okay. You have to start with something first. And remember, the quote from Darwin last week, give me an archetypal organism with 5 senses and whatever else, and I can explain everything else. Well, that give you is a big give you. Darwin didn't know genetics. He thought that there were very, very simple organisms, and there's no such thing. Every organism is complex. There's simpler organisms than other ones, but even the simplest is really complex. But regardless, through natural selection, different types of eyes have emerged in evolutionary history. Biologists use the range of less complex, light-sensitive structures that exist in living species today to hypothesize the various evolutionary stages eyes may have gone through. Here's how this is my last one, that is, yes. Here's how some scientists think some eyes may have evolved. The simple, and I put in purple here, nothing is simple. Simpler maybe, but not simple. Light-sensitive spot on the skin of some ancestral creature gave it some tiny survival advantage, perhaps allowing it to evade a predator. And I'm mentioning this is natural selection. Some reason this creature has a light-sensitive spot on its skin and the rest of his brothers and sisters don't. And this gives him a competitive advantage, okay? Maybe now he can see a predator that he couldn't see before because now light has changed as the predator's coming. You see that sort of idea?
It's Rudolph.
Say?
It's Rudolph.
Yes, right, the red nose. I like that. That's really good. Rudolph, the red nose, okay. Yeah, random changes then created the depression in the light-sensitive patch, okay? Random changes. A deepening pit that made vision a little sharper. At the same time, the pit's opening gradually narrowed, so light entered through a small aperture, like a pinhole in a camera. What's the mechanism for all of these changes?
Lots of time.
Well, there's time, but the mechanism is what? It's random genetic mutations. They happen. They just happen. There's no direction, there's no design, nothing. It just happens by accident. Every change that had to confer a survival advantage, no matter how slight, eventually the light-sensitive spot evolved into a retina, the layer of cells and pigment at the back of the human eye. Over time, a lens formed at the front of the eye. I love that. Over time, a lens formed. It could have arisen as a double-layered transparent tissue containing increasing amounts of liquid that gave it the convex curvature of the human eye. That's a mouthful. And then I put in purple, there are an amazing amount of assumptions here that are brushed off with typical general evolutionary language. A lens appeared. A lens formed. Why? I'm an engineer. I would like to know how that happened. Okay, that is it. I'm approaching this from a process point of view. What process creates a lens? I would like to know. And then at the right distance from everything else, when all this. Okay, the first animals with anything resembling an eye lived about 550 million years ago. And according to one scientist's calculations, only 364,000 years. I love the specificity of that number. All right, would have been needed for a camera-like eye to evolve from a light-sensitive patch. I love the specificity of that. He came down to not maybe half a million or no 364,000. He's got it right down, okay, to that kind of number. All right. Listen, I know I'm caricaturing slightly here, but this is an evolutionist answering the question that they very fairly put at the beginning, which was, what does an evolutionist skeptic like myself ask about these things? And I think this is this is his answer. Now, again, you are left with the choice. Is that how it happened? Now, you could say, yeah, okay, but at every point in time, God interjected himself. Then that's not good science. Now you've abandoned science, and now you have just basically said, God did it. And that doesn't answer anything per se. Or you could say, God did it and created a whole eye, and this is how it's designed, okay? In that sense, you'd say, well, does that mess up the science too? But let me ask you this. I would like you to give me a purely scientific explanation for how that pen got there.
You took it out of your pocket and walked over.
Good, okay, that's fine. Where'd the pen come from? And don't say my pocket. Okay. China. You see, it's got 5 or 6 parts. There's a spring in there. There's ink. It's, I can take it apart. I can look at it, okay, and all of that. We know it's been designed, okay? Does the fact that there is a creator of this pen in any way negate your ability to study it, to figure out how it works, to even mimic the way that it works? It does not. Did I say that too complex? I'll say it more easily. You know it was made by somebody. Does that mean you can't study it now because there's a creator? You didn't undermine science at all. But what evolutionists are left with is to take a creator out of the equation completely and now tell you how that thing popped up accidentally through some random processes. And that, to me, is shocking. All right. What Biz is going to do for us now, because this is her expertise. Now I'm going to leave it to Biz. She's going to come up and she's going to give us an excellent explanation of whale evolution. Thank you, Biz. Can I don't know if you want, just maybe carry it.
What?
Do whatever.
Oh, is this the mic?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thanks. I don't know what you want me to do with this. Does it clip on? Okay. All right, so I teach science. I'm a biology teacher. Evolution is a part of my required curriculum. I have to test. I have to give the same tests that everyone else does. And I think in a lot of my time as a Christian, grown up in the church, people gloss over the science and they like to laugh at it. And if you're talking with someone who truly believes in the science and you're laughing at what their presuppositions are, that's just going to shut down the argument. So we're going to talk through what science knows about whales, right? Science is inherently asking questions about the world around us, just like we are. So where's your book? There we go. All right. So what do we know about whales? Whales are a part of what we call the cetacean family. There is two major types of whales. We have whales with teeth, and we have whales with baleen. Victor sent out in the email the idea of baleen whales. How do we get baleen whales? But I'm just going to talk about whales in general. He also mentioned that whales came from bears. That's not the current reigning hypothesis. Currently, we think the closest living relative to a whale is actually a hippo. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that whales came from hippos. That means that they share a common ancestor. Saying that whales came from hippos would be like saying that you came from your cousin. Which you didn't, right? Like, you might have characteristics in common with them because of a shared ancestor, but you did not come from your cousin, okay? So this is the sort of timeline of how we are imagining, based on current hypotheses, the family tree is branching out. So you can see that all the baleen whales must have shared some sort of ancestor in common. All the toothed whales had some ancestor in common, and at some point those two came together millions of years ago. Hey, the oh brother doesn't help an argument, does it? So, starting with what is a whale? Science asks questions, okay? Things we know about whales. We know that there are 90 species, okay? They are warm-blooded with a double-loop circulatory system, and they use lungs for oxygen acquisition. They are K-strategists, which means that they have a couple young, and they invest a lot of time and energy in making sure their young are successful, as opposed to like frogs, which lay a whole bunch of eggs and then say, good luck, kids, right? They have mammary glands, and they are...
No, I love it.
That's what our strategists are, right? Okay?
Well, that's how I raise my kids.
Just have as many as you can and good luck, right? They feed milk to their young.
Well, we originally had 50 kids.
Survival of the fittest, right?
Sorry. Wow. Sorry about that. Sorry, Biz.
You're good, you're good. You guys are not worse than teenagers.
Yeah.
You're fine. All right. They have mammary glands, so they feed milk to their young, although the milk of a whale, in case you're wondering, is about the consistency of toothpaste. Because, like, if you're in water, you don't want the milk to, like, float away. It's also really, really, really calorically dense, right? Because you need to build all that blubber. All right. I know, you've never thought about fatty toothpaste now.
I'm saying give some whale milk for my kids.
Maybe that'll put some meat on their bones,
Yeah.
right?
Fatten them up.
They have placental gestation, so they obviously have a uterus and placenta just like humans do. All of these things tell us that they're mammals and not fish. Okay, so back in Darwin's days, we're like, that's weird. Everything else in the water is a fish, but these are clearly not fish. So science has been trying to figure out where whales came from. Way back in the day, John Ray in 1693 said, whales are mammals. And people were shocked. Right? So if they are mammals, where did they come from? So either did terrestrial mammals come from whales? Did mammals start in the water and then climb out? Or did whales come from terrestrial mammals? Did they start on land and then climb into the water? Right? In 1859, Darwin himself proposed that they came from bears, and then he took it back because he decided he was wrong. And that's okay, science is allowed to do take-backs. In 1883, there was a guy named Flower, and he started looking at the vestigial structures. We're going to go a deeper dive into those in just a second, but a vestigial structure is just the idea that if you have something that is small and useless, it had to come from somewhere. So it probably came from an ancestor at which point it had some sort of use. We'll get into that in a second. And he was the first to propose that they came from things with hooves, ungulates. So horse and deer and hippopotamuses. Fast forward a chunk of time, they started looking at the teeth, and the dental characteristics confirmed the link with small carnivorous ungulates, way back. There were things with hooves that ate meat, and they had similar teeth to what we think these whales came from. All right, so science works independently of each other. So there's a whole bunch of different kinds of science. Obviously, if you go and you become a scientist, you become a hyper expert in one area. And so we're going to look at some of the information that each of these experts have done information. Overall morphology, the geography of the fossils and where they came from, the geochemistry of the fossils around them, where that tells us they grew up. And then also looking at modern whales, our vestigial structures, looking at the embryology, and then finally a biochemical analysis of the proteins and genes. All right. In the fossil record alone, we have dozens of transition fossils. In these transition fossils, we have found intermediaries that show the movement of teeth from differentiated teeth. So just like you have front teeth and molars and incisors and all the things, whales don't. Since they swallow their food whole, they don't need to do anything special with their teeth. All of their teeth are just sort of peg-shaped. So we have intermediary fossils that started with differentiated teeth and became less differentiated until we get to modern whales with the peg-shaped teeth. We have intermediary fossils that show legs under the body, which shows that they were on land and had the musculature appropriate to handle gravity without the buoyancy of water. We also have intermediaries that show it sort of moving to the side, which usually shows that they're moving back and forth between the land and the water, the amphibious of some kind. And then in whales and in some of the skeletons, fossils we have found, the pelvis is fully detached. You can't walk on land with a detached pelvis. So probably that had to live in the water. There's no other reason for that. We also see, and I know Victor mentioned this, nostrils moving from the front of the skull, and then over time, nostrils moving to sort of the top. Think of like a hippopotamus, how they can breathe without their full head being out of the water. We can't do that. And then finally backwards, some whales still have a double blowhole, just like you have two nostril holes, they have two nostril holes. It's just in a different part of their skull. And some have evolved to just a single blowhole, because there's no advantage to having the two. Good so far?
So just to clarify, if you're starting at the top of your diagram, those are different creatures that we've found in the fossil record.
Yes.
That evolutionists are connecting together.
They are the ones, now it's not a perfect timeline, it's not A to B to C to D, but we are saying that this is probably the oldest one. This point, having thick bony walled ear around the middle ear, freshwater semi-aquatic habitat, is true of everything after that pink point.
Gotcha.
Okay, and then we move down to a next branch of the tree, and some of these ancestors did have a large, powerful tail, and some did not. Okay, and so every time you see a pink point, it's true for everything after. So they sort of take the pieces of the puzzle and fit it together.
But like that second one that looks like a wolf, at least from where I'm sitting. Yeah.
Into Highness?
The second one.
Second one.
That looks like an armadillo, but yeah, that
Yes.
one there. From that spot to the next guy, what's between them? Are there, you got a clearly a land animal, it seems
Yes.
to me, and now all of a sudden you've got something with flippers and a fluke.
Right, so this guy?
Yeah.
The Ambulocetus?
So is there more in the middle of the two of them?
Yes, well, we don't necessarily have that guy.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. That's
Okay,
helpful.
yep.
Yes.
Because it hasn't been discovered.
It's assumed in one sense.
Right.
There's an assumption,
Right,
yeah.
because not every skeleton produces a fossil.
Right.
Right? Conditions actually have to be very, very, very particular. You need it to be covered quickly by sediment so that it's an anaerobic environment. You need no oxygen, because if you have oxygen, then you have rotting, and if you rot, then you break down. All right, so these are just some examples. So 47 million years ago, we have skulls who have nostrils in the front, and then our best estimate at around 36 million years ago, you can see it moving backwards all the way up to, this is a modern Amazon River dolphin, and his nostrils are fully back, his blowhole, right? All right, so starting with the fossil record. And honestly, the fossil record is where I feel like a lot of creationists don't have a good answer. Like, so, but what about this? I see bones. Okay, so this is just a sampling of 4. There were more than this, but Victor told me to chill and do less. So These are sort of the 4 ancestors that we have the most proof of. Some of them we have dozens and dozens of examples. So this guy, fully terrestrial, we find him and around his fossils other terrestrial mammals, so that makes sense. Next guy over, based on what we're finding around him, we have found their teeth and their bones both in freshwater environments and land environments, so we're assuming that they were actually able to move back and forth. There's some evidence that they probably laid their eggs on land, but that they did a lot of their hunting in the water. Next up, we have this guy. He probably lived most of his life in deep freshwater. He still had enough of a pelvis and legs that he was able to walk on land, but he would be kind of awkward about it, more like if you think of seals and walruses, like, well, technically they can move on land, but it's not pretty, right? And finally, we have this guy. We think he was the first one to be fully aquatic that we have proof of. There are terrestrial leaves around them, but I mean, leaves can go into the water. But generally, we find populations of marine mollusks. Those aren't going to like leap their way onto the land. So we can assume that he was actually found in the water. Mostly aquatic, again, probably could work on land, but it wouldn't be pretty. Now, if we're looking at modern whales, look at that. Vestigial evidence in modern whales. So, if there is a creator, why would he make mistakes? Right? That's what a lot of these questions are.
Could you
Yes?
define vestigial?
Yes. Okay, so a vestigial structure is usually defined as a reduced structure that is non-functional, that had a function in a ancestor years ago. So the human appendix, if I take out your appendix, it doesn't hurt you. Right? Okay. Some people consider wisdom teeth to be a vestigial structure because they don't actually add, and sometimes they just actually make life worse. Okay. So for a whale, there are several species of whales that have vestigial pelvic bones, femurs, and tibia. They're not attached at all to the spine. And so if there were a creator, why would he throw those bones in there? Right? The only good explanation would be that it came from an ancestor, and then the less they used their legs, the less they needed them, and then there was no advantage as the changes happened for you to have working legs. As we look through the fossil record itself, we have noticed that these bones are more pronounced in the earlier species, and they become smaller and less pronounced in later species, and there's many whales who have none at all at this point. Breathing. Whales have a diaphragm, just like you do. So your diaphragm is the muscle here, between your lungs and all your other guts. And your diaphragm is what actually makes you breathe. You don't breathe with your ribs. Okay, that is different than a whale. Whales breathe with their ribs. You have rib muscles, but your diaphragm is actually what's contracting, and every time you take a breath in, your diaphragm contracts, and that's what makes your lungs bigger. And then your diaphragm relaxes, and you breathe back out. Whales use their actual rib muscles to inflate and deflate in order to take their breaths. But they still have a diaphragm. Why would you have one if you're not going to use it? Sense organs. Whales do not use the same senses we do. You guys know that a lot of them use echolocation. Okay, so that's something new and novel that we don't have. But they don't have a sense of smell. But even without a sense of smell, they still have olfactory nerves. They have the nerves that connect from the nostrils to the brain, but they don't use them. In fact, some of them have the nerves, but the brain itself, that part of the brain is gone. They have no way of smelling because their brain can't sense it. The ear canal is closed. So they're still at...
How do we know that? How do we know that they can't smell?
Because if you don't have that part of your brain, you can't do it.
Okay, well, you said it was connected to their brain, but apparently it just doesn't work.
I have not done a deep dive into that, to be fair. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean.
That's a good question.
You're right, though. They've got something that looks like the olfactory nerves, but there isn't a part of the brain like our part that would
To process it.
Okay.
So.
Whereas sharks, something
Yes.
in the water, they're really good
Right.
at smelling.
They're highly dependent on that, for sure. Their ear canal is closed in most of them. Usually the ear canal is less than 1 millimeter. And then even as it goes in, it just sort of pinches off into nothing. So they had ears at some point. We're assuming their ancestors had ears, but they are no longer using them, so there's no need to maintain that canal. In fact, all whales have a collection of the muscles devoted to their external ears. So like some of you might be able to wiggle your ears. Anyone in here know how to do that or know someone in their life? Yep. If not, I'm sure you've seen dogs or cats who can like move their ears at will. That is definitely a land animal trait. So why would whales have ear muscles if they don't have ears and they're underwater? Some whales even have little tiny ear flaps. That's called the ear pinnae. There's no ear canal, but there's still a little like boop on the outside. Belugas in particular are known for having the rudimentary ear pinnae. But like actually that makes them less efficient because then you got drag, right? If you know any swimmers, they want to reduce all drag all the time. Okay, so these are some questions. Why are these here if they don't have a purpose? Morphological connections back to the whole ungulate theory. So, for example, the ankle bones in the whales that they do have, and the ankle bones that we have found in their ancestors, in their fossils, are a shape that we refer to as a double pulley shape, which is very unique. Your knees are not shaped like that. I don't know if you've seen what your knees are shaped like. You sort of have a single pulley where you have like the double bump and the single bump, and it goes like this. And then you have your kneecap in the front. But we do find this weird thing in whales, we find it in other hoofed animals, and we find them in hippopotamuses.
Ungulate would be like a cow?
Yes.
Okay.
And antelope and deer, anything, yeah, generally hoofed creatures. The middle ear, if you look at that, so they don't have a sense of hearing, but we still have some bones in there. The middle ear has, in the fossil record, we've seen intermediate shapes that is somewhere between what we find in the modern whale and somewhere between what we find in the modern hoofed animals, the ungulates. The angle of the hammer is actually the opposite of most other mammals, so that is found again only in whales and ungulates.
Can I ask you one question?
Yeah.
Sorry, Liz. On ungulates, are there ungulates that exist that are not in the whale? Like a horse, like you don't.
Horses are further cousins. We're generally talking about two-toed hooves animals.
Two-toed hooves.
So-
I got you right.
Okay.
But there are other ungulates that have the same kind of ankle bones, but they're not in the whale evolutionary. They're over the chain.
I can check that. I don't know
Yeah,
that.
yeah, okay. You know what I mean. So,
Yes.
it would be, to me, it would be one thing if this kind of ankle bone was only shared by these three kind of animals, and they're all in the whale.
And if it was 100%, 100%, 100%.
Yeah. And if there's others that also have
Right.
it that aren't in the whale evolution, well, then that argument kind of disappears in my mind. You see what I mean? Because then you don't have to have a whale come from an ungulate with ankle bones like this when there are other ungulates with ankle bones like that didn't produce whales.
Yes, I'm following your logic.
Oh, that
Yep.
was my question. Sorry about that. Go
That's
on,
okay.
Please. Sorry.
I became a whale expert in the past week.
Yeah.
So, embryological evidence. I know I've seen in a lot of creationists like, oh, the similarities between embryos were hand-drawn and over-exaggerated. And so, like, here's some pictures. These are all embryos of modern dolphin, okay, in various stages. So you can see that sort of beak thing is not a bird beak, it's the dolphin mouth. So again, we're going back to if there was a creator, why are there mistakes? Okay, so this is similar to the vestigial arguments of like, why would you have characteristics that present in utero that don't actually benefit the adult form? So in some baleen species of whales, they go through an intermediary phase that they actually grow teeth while they are in utero. They grow teeth, and then the teeth get reabsorbed, and then they grow baleen.
And what's baleen again?
Baleen is their filter feeding system. It's made of the same thing as your fingernails, keratin, and it's really, really long. And what whales do is they take a big gulp of fish, and then they squirt the water out, and they keep the fish in.
It's a screen.
Yeah. In many whale species, we see hind limb buds. Bud just means like a little nubbin, right? So like they get that first little bump that's supposed to be the back legs, but then they get reabsorbed. And in some species, they're absent entirely. In some species, those are that vestigial pelvis and femurs. Again, with the earlobes, like why would they need earlobes in utero if the adult form doesn't have it? Okay, that tells us that there were genes from prior ancestors that were useful, but are now shut down and no longer useful in the adult form. And again, with the sense of smell, some of them start growing the olfactory lobe of their brain, but then it is reabsorbed and rededicated as it grows up into the adult form by the time it's born. Ditto with the blowhole development. So their nostrils, just like yours, start in the front of their face. As the embryo develops, it is moving up and it's moving up and it's moving up until they're finally born and the blowhole is in the correct place. There's a lot of mushing that goes on in the embryo phases. Just like human embryos, at one point your backbone is longer than your body, so it looks like you have a tail, right? But then your body grows and to fit that, and so then your tail is reabsorbed. It's not, it's just always been there. But like, so the blowhole, it forms in the front, but then as the rest of the body grows, it seems to move backwards. All right, last slide. Molecular biology evidence. All right, so as science has moved forward, so has our evidence. These are 4 different proteins, for example. So we were talking about proteins and amino acids. This is the specific amino acid sequence. Each highlight that you see is a different amino acid. And then these are their 3D molecular shapes, so that you can see the impact of the amino acid change to the shape. There were a couple scientists back in 1985 and compared 46 different mammal species. They are comparing the myoglobin, which is, like if you ever cut a steak and it looks like there's blood, it's not really blood, it's this stuff. But it does help with oxygen transfer through muscles. The lens alpha-crystalline, this is the protein that makes up the lens of your eye. And cytochrome C, which is critical in the mitochondrial powerhouse of the cell job, where they take the glucose and the oxygen and they break it down to give you energy. With all of that, and then they repeat it again because they're like, that's an interesting trend. Let's try it again, but with more. So they tried it again with 72 species and then even expanded their protein into the alpha and beta hemoglobin, which are the 2 parts of the hemoglobin that carry oxygen in your blood. And then ribonuclease, which is one of the modifiers of the RNA molecule. Through all of those, and then repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated, whales are most closely related to ungulates, the hoofed animals. All right, I'm going to hand this back to Victor. Do you guys have any other questions for? Oh, great, great.
So if you have anything else to say.
Nah, we're good.
So you need to get the
Do you want the mic?
microphone.
No. Go ahead and, does anybody have questions for Biz? I'm going to draw something real quick.
Do you have a 2nd grade version of this?
So, on purpose, I wanted this to be a higher level because this is what students see. This is what they see in high school. This is what they go off to college and they see. And it looks like an overwhelming amount of data.
Yes.
It does. And so Victor said, teach this like an evolutionist. And so we are. Yep. I'm happy to explain any of this.
Oh, no.
I can break any of it down, but I deliberately wanted it to feel overwhelming.
Good.
That was my goal.
I don't feel as done.
You're not dumb. You're not dumb.
No, but it's good. It is overwhelming in the sense that there's a lot of evidence there, and you either can say, you know what, I'm not a biologist, I'm turning my brain off. Let me go find a creationist that tells me whatever I need to know. Or you can start thinking through these things. And I trimmed out some of her slides.
I had more.
So there was more to look at. Oh, sure, but thank you. But just here's the difference, okay, that you have to decide before any of this. This is Darwin, okay? This is your one-celled organism from which all of life comes from it. So maybe at this point it's the ungulate branch, and then ultimately the whale is up here.
but you then even go back further to a one-celled organism. It all comes from there. Or a creationist model is going to be Genesis 1, where God made each according to its kind. You've heard that phrase. It's repeated a lot in Genesis chapter 1. And so we'd say this is the whale kind. Okay? You understand when Biz is going through those vestigial things, why are there leg thing bones in the back end of the whale when clearly the whale doesn't have legs? Well, if you're a Darwinist, then you're saying, well, one of the prior ancestors of the whale had, like these ungulates, had legs and obviously used the legs. And eventually, you've still got a vestige of those legs there. It's the vestigial organ argument. Here, we would just simply say, well, those little bones there, maybe we haven't figured out yet. Now, actually, some people, yeah, I know, okay. and they help. Talks about it. Yeah, but they help with reproduction. They attach the muscles that help the whale with reproduction. So I kind of like to call it, how do I put it now? I put it in my book, the arrogance of implied omniscience. Okay, and that is, so I'll say it again, the arrogance of implied omniscience. That scientists say, well, if we don't know what its function was, then it must not have a function. And I'm saying you just haven't figured it out yet. Just like with the nerve that's going supposedly to a part of the brain that's missing. Is that a vestige of a prior evolutionary thing, or has God, because I would agree absolutely. I don't think God throws in random unusable body parts into his design. Everything in your body has a purpose. Let me backtrack on the vestigial argument. In the 1890s, scientists identified about 180 body parts in humans that they claimed are vestigial, like wisdom teeth, like the appendix, like the thyroid gland, like the spleen. Okay? Now, the appendix, we've been removing appendices for years, okay? For decades. Now we realize it actually does something in the digestive system and in immunology, right? In the immune system as well. But for years we just basically said, get rid of it. Now sometimes it bursts and there's nothing you can do, okay? You've got to get rid of it. And thankfully it isn't vital like, oh, let's just get rid of that liver. He'll survive, okay? But it does do something. And what evolutionists have been forced to do over the last century plus is whittle down that number more and more and more. Body hair was believed to be a vestige from when we were ape-like creatures. Okay, all of the vestigial arguments. And then DNA. This is interesting too, because I find this fascinating. Scientists talked about junk DNA. And initially they said 98% of the human DNA is junk. Now, junk just simply means it didn't produce the proteins or something of that nature, okay. Now, they've had to consistently reconfigure that. Now, when they say junk, what do they mean? They mean specifically it's left over from previous evolutionary stages and we no longer need it. Do you know that there is a gene in the human genome that produces yolk, like egg yolk, okay? And if humans are up here, let's say, well, we know at some point we came from something down here that produced eggs. And this gene is in our human genome, and it's a yolk gene, and I could go right now to the BioLogos website. Francis Collins, he was the head of the National Association of Science during Obama's years and all that. He is a Christian who believes that God used evolution. And he says this is a clear sign. Even a dummy, I'm paraphrasing, but even a dummy can understand this. Why would humans have a gene in their genome that produces yolk? Now, here's the problem. Humans have about 23,000 genes, but they produce about 200,000 proteins. From an engineer's point of view, I look at that and I say, suppose I have a factory and I need to build a car and a computer and something else, a toaster, I don't know. And I need all of the parts to make these things. Can I find a way to make them where I can use the same part in each of those machines? That would help greatly with my production. So I use the same nut and bolt, or I use the same whatever, okay? And that's what happens with genetics. You have a code, a piece of code that doesn't just produce yolk, it also is producing something else. We just don't know what that something else is yet. And that's my arrogance of implied omniscience. The guys in BioLogos, which again, Christian organization, but evolutionists, would say that gene produces yolk down here. It's here, it has no business being here. It's a vestige of this evolutionary chain. And it does nothing. And I would say, give it some time. You're going to figure out that it does do something. Why do I know that? Because I'm a biologist? Hardly. I mean, really, not at all, okay? Biz is up here doing this. Oh, yeah, blah, 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 blah. Okay, no, I'm not a biologist, all right? But I do know history. And I know you told us a little over 100 years ago there are 180 parts in the human body that are worthless. They're vestiges. They do nothing. And now you're telling us there's only about 12 left. Have you not learned your lesson yet? That would be me. That's what I would say, okay? And so on and on we go with all of this. So what you would be faced with doing in this thorough, and it could be even more thorough, because she had more slides, okay, was you've got to go through all of these. You do. Now, who here is going to be an expert in this? I'm not. I did write a book about it. But, other than that, no, but seriously, you do have to be able to at least point out some inconsistencies. All of those used to be considered, well, some still are, like the wisdom teeth, okay, as vestiges of a prior evolutionary stage. Wisdom teeth, just for the fun of it. Wisdom teeth would be very useful if our heads were bigger. Maybe human heads were bigger. I'm not talking about wisdom teeth in an ape, which supposedly is an ancestor of a human, and we have it. No, I mean human beings used to be bigger. Do I have any biblical evidence or proof of that? I've got somebody like the Nephilim. I've got somebody like Goliath. Okay, I do have biblical reports of humans that are bigger. I don't have to run to ape-like creatures supposedly down the evolutionary chain here who used to eat raw meat instead of it being cooked and needed more incisors or whatever you call those things, molars, I guess, to crunch the food and all that stuff. All I need is actually bigger humans. A bigger jaw that can accommodate those teeth. And humans have actually been getting somewhat smaller, in reference to those bigger humans. That's a possibility. There's some biblical possibility to that. These are questions. I'm not an expert, but there are questions that can be asked. That's Darwin's great evolutionary icon. There it is. There's the human hair. Chuck Norris doesn't need as much hair as the African ape back here, okay? But does your hair help you with certain things? Of course it does, And it's strategically placed in certain areas. You know how much, women would be able to tell you this. I can't. Because you shave it. Do you not get chafing in there at all or whatever? Because the hair is a natural lubricant for your skin coming on, when you're sweating and all that. Sorry, that was a weird question. Yeah, you're right. For you women who don't shave, you would be over there. No. No, I am not. Thank you very much.
I thought you cared about your subject.
We have a friend from Maine, and they don't shave. Legs are in there.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway. All right. So, I'm sorry. Okay. All of this is to say, what Biz has done, I think very helpfully, is giving you a nice idea of the evolutionary arguments. They're real. They're scientists doing science. Now, they're trying to do it many times in the absence of God, right? They're trying to figure out how this process can happen. I mean, you can interject God here if you want at the beginning. He makes the starting stuff and then just lets it run. But they're trying to figure out how you got all of this through the random genetic changes that must have taken place so that we can, I mean, here, this is, I think, about 6 million years of evolution. That's what this is. Okay, so in 6 million years isn't a lot of time, it doesn't seem to me, to change that into that. But that's what you have to do, and there's nobody directing it. There's nobody saying, hey, that whale needs a fluke, so I'll give it a fluke. No, it has to come by itself, randomly, through a change in genes. We'll talk a little bit about that next week. But 99% of genetic mutations are either harmful or do nothing different to the organism. 99%. So now you got 1% that you're relying on to be innovative. And not just once or twice, but it's got to be tens of thousands of times, I guess. It's got to be tons to get from here to here. Okay, that is it. That was your science lesson for today. I hope you're happy, honey. Yes, Cynthia.
I have a question for Biz.
Cynthia has a question for Biz.
Are you allowed in your classes to point out the flaws of the vestigial thing and be able to, are you allowed to say, by the way, though, we now know that these supposed vestigial things do have a purpose?
Yeah, I've had to argue with other teachers about, there was a test question about the vestigial pelvises of whale bones. I'm like, you can't ask that as a question anymore because it's false. And they're like, well, but, I'm like, but it's wrong. Like science says that there is a distinct reproductive advantage in these species that have it. Like, so like, let's find a different question. For my students, I usually, and this year is weird because I have a student teacher, so I'm not teaching evolution. I do premise it with, some of you probably come with faith backgrounds, and I think that you need to know the arguments regardless. So, and I'm like, if you are interested and you would like to know more about the faith-based, you know, like where this came from, come to me, I have lots of resources.
Okay.
You can do that?
So you can say that, but you can't
I mean, I haven't gotten busted for it yet.
Okay,
I don't know. I don't present it.
Yeah.
Also,
Right.
my evolutionary unit is the one that I don't lecture on. So like, I had to make all this from scratch
Yeah.
because I don't feel comfortable standing and teaching it. So I give them the resources they need and the practice they need to do well on the assessments. But I do premise it with, like, your faith is not in conflict with science, and if you have questions about how that works, I would love to talk to you.
Yeah, and I mean, you want good scientists, right? And good scientists ask hard questions, even of things that are accepted truth, like Galileo, right, in his day. You want a scientist that says, in fact, that is science, right? As soon as the scientist says, oh, that's fact and we don't have to think about it, you've really, in one sense, ceased to be a scientist. The really good scientist would say, hey, you know what? I know this has been the dogma for this area for the last 50 years, but I'm going to question it. That's the kind of scientist you want, really. Unfortunately, that's not the kind of scientists that we produce often when we teach things as dogma. And I'll close with this because, you know, our kids grew up in public schools, but over in Africa. They were being taught things in textbooks and in photocopied things from year after year after year that the teachers did to save money on textbooks that had been proven false by the evolutionists. And they were still teaching it today as if it were true. And I wrote a note one day and sent it with my daughter Natasha. And I said, just give this to your teacher. And she's like, oh, Dad, you know, just let her know that what she's saying there about Lucy, the supposed hominid precursor to humans, has now been debunked by evolutionists. She wasn't a precursor to humans. She was just a knuckle-dragging ape-like creature. That's what they say. But you keep teaching it as if it's an evolutionary stage for us humans, and that's false. And that's the problem. When the original discovery comes out, it's on the front cover of National Geographic. And when they finally figure out they were wrong, it's buried in a footnote on page 252. Okay, that's it. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much that you give us brains to think through these things. Thank you that we are fearfully and wonderfully made in your image. And we ask that you would continue to help us process these things. Now, as we go to worship, we do ask that you would help each one that is involved in leading us in worship, and that everything that we do here in our worship service would be glorifying to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, Biz. Thank you, Biz, for that.